Hi there, and thank you for tuning in. The reason why I have a smile on my face is that I've just been watching a video by Steve Perry where he said that if gear didn't matter, we would all be running around with fat wallets and entry-level cameras. And that got me smiling, and it still does. The subject for today is this lens, the Nikon Nikkor 1.8G or AFS. And let's dive right into it. So I found this lens over at mpb.com. It set me back 139 euros. And I'm not sponsored by MPB, but I do like to advocate them because I think they are really easy to do business with. And especially if you want to trade in some old gear, their workflow works really well. I can only recommend mpb.com. This is the European version of MPB. I think they have divisions also in the US. As you can see, it comes nicely wrapped and protected. And the lens itself comes with a lens hood and the lens cap. And the lens hood is a little bit new to me. I have a lot of vintage lenses and there it's not so usual. But here actually a lens hood is included as part of the package. So here it is, the 1.8G, and I just brought out the 1.4 AF and the 1.2 AIS so you can see roughly how they compare. The first thing you notice is that this one is very light. It's 180 grams relative to the AF version that is around 220, so it's 40 grams lighter, which relatively is a big drop. The other thing you will notice is that the glass sits quite deep. The front glass sits quite deep in the lens, so it's well protected from the elements. And also flare, I would think, would be difficult to produce, at least some kinds of flare. And if you then in addition mount the lens hood, then you have a pretty good protection from both the elements and from flare. Contrary to the AF version and also the AIS version, there is no aperture ring. You can still change the aperture if you go in here and find the lever. It's right here somewhere. There it is. Here you can see you can still change the aperture manually. But there's no way of changing the aperture on the lens itself like you can on this one, for instance. No such option on this one. You have to do it on your camera body. The manual focus ring here it works okay, but it's not a premium feel. It's just approved, but it would have been nicer if this had been a more smooth operation here. It feels quite budget-ish, if you ask me. There is a distance scale here, both in meters and feet as we know them. And also there is a depth of field scale, but only for f16. That's the only one they have marked here. There is a button here to switch between autofocus and manual focus. And in the autofocus option, as soon as you grab the manual focus ring, then it becomes manual focus. That's why you have the MA option here. Think of this as being the autofocus option here. There's no vibration reduction in this lens at all, which I think is not necessary. It is a fast lens and it's relatively short. The lens is not weather sealed. There is a gasket here that protects to some degree, but the lens, according to Nikon, is not weather sealed, so be a little bit careful with the elements. But dust, I think, will have difficulties getting in, at least between the lens and the camera, because there is this gasket here. The minimum focus distance is 45 centimeters. And if you, like me, find that to be a little bit too long, what you can do is actually you can just take the lens. If you really have something you would like to focus close up, you can just take the lens and mount it the other way around. Be a little bit careful with that, but just hold it up against the camera body. And then you can actually, by moving the camera and lens together, find the focus point and take a shot there. That's, of course, if you're in a pickle, but it works okay. But 45 centimeters is as close as it will go to your subject in what I would call normal operation mode. Finally, if you're curious what the lens looks like mounted on, say, a Nikon D4, then here it is. I'm just turning it so you can get an impression. I think it looks okay. And also the noise from the autofocus, if I just do a little bit of, you can almost hear it as it's hunting here for focus. I think it works pretty silent. Maybe not silent enough if you're a videographer, but if you're a wedding photographer, I think this would be okay in a church, right? So I don't think anyone would react to this noise. Maybe more this noise, right? I think it's a proof in terms of looks and how much noise the autofocus makes. So if we start out by looking at the MTF chart provided by Nikon, you can see here they only deliver data for fully open f1.8, but you can see that the contrast is pretty good in the center, but then it drops towards the edges as you would expect. But you can also see these two lines, they move apart, meaning that we would expect to see some aberrations in the corners. Center sharpness is okay, but it drops quite systematically towards the edges. I actually had a little bit higher hopes. It is not a very expensive lens, but I had actually hoped that the lines here would have been a little bit more flat when it comes to the sharpness. Compare this to the 1.8 for the Nikon mirrorless cameras here, a lens that is 3 times as expensive, but you can also see the contrast line here is very impressive and sharpness the same. So this is what a really, really good lens looks like. So I think we can already now say that there will be some challenges in the corners with the 1.8G. So here I have a whiteboard with a few dollar bills and a euro note mounted. And if we go in and look at the center sharpness here, to the left you have 1.8 and to the left you have 5.6 and to the right you have 1.8. And clearly, stop down, this lens performs much better in the center. You can see much more detail in the pillars here. That's more difficult over here. You can also see in God We Trust, the contrast here is much better than it is over here fully open. Going to some of the corners here just to have a look at that. I normally look at this euro sign here. You can see it's much, if not sharper, then at least the contrast is much better here. 5.6 to the left, and also if you look at the bricks in the bridge, much better. If we go bottom right, I have a little number that I look at, 157 here. It's possible to read at 5.6. Very difficult to read at 1.8. And finally, I study the lines here in Lincoln's head here, and you can see the lines very clearly here to the left where they are much more blurred. Here to the right, and also if you look at the yellow 05s here, they're very difficult to read over here. United States Federal Reserve System, also that is very difficult to not see that it's much sharper here to the left. So I think all in all, it is as we would expect, that 5.6 stop down this lens performs much better, both in center and in the corners. If we take an image that is not a sort of lab test image, but more a live image, if you like, and go in close here and look at the image quality, you can see I have the fully open to the left and 5.0 to the right, just to spice it up a little bit. And I think actually if we look at these images here, the center sharpness is very similar in these two cases. And of course, if you zoom out, you will see that I have zoomed in crazy close in order to make this compare. So I think it does pretty well here in the center sharpness. What I do not like to see is up here to the right when I look at this, because you can see here to the right at 5.0 there are no aberrations, but here to the left you can see a lot of purple color. And of course you can remove this in post with a bit of luck. Sometimes you can just click on a check mark in Lightroom and that takes care of the problem. Sometimes you have to go in and actually manually pull some sliders in order to make it happen. But I think this one in the corners generates a lot of aberrations, as you see here. Same goes if I dive into some of the details here. You can see right here a purple line. And also here purple coloring. So definitely this lens has an issue with aberrations. But again, I mean, I'm not sure if you would even notice when you just look at the picture here, because of the viewing distance. There's a lot of forgiveness in that, but from a more technical point of view and zooming in 300%, definitely you can see the difference between fully open and stop down here. Another example here shot with some distance to the subject. You can see here, if I go in close, that here there actually is significant difference in the in the sharpness. You have 6.3 to the right and you have 1.8 to the left. And again, you see that even though this is center sharpness, it is much better with the 6.3. Also here, if you go in close here, you can see 6.3. There's much more detail and contrast here in the leaf here. And finally here, an illustration of the difference between 1.8 to the left and 6.3 in terms of the bokeh. You can see the background here is completely blurred. But if we ignore that and just go in and look at the details and the contrast, you can see again at 6.3, there's much more detail in the leaf here. But of course, if you zoom out, then the subject here stands out much more in the 1.8, simply due to the shallow depth of field that renders the background very, very blurred. But here, very big difference in the level of details you see in the structure of the leaf. I had expected to see aberrations in the corners of the frame, but I was surprised to see here that in high contrast situations, even in the center of the frame, fully open here to the left, you can see there's purple color here, whereas to the right, let me just see if I can unlock that, so we can see more clearly that to the right here, there are no purple colors here, right? So even when we're talking the center of the frame fully open, you do see aberrations. So the way I have tested focus shift here is that I have taken 2 shots at different apertures, one fully open to the left and one stop down at f8 to the right. And I did it so that I focused fully open, just like your DSLR will do when you're not shooting in live view. And then I simply did not touch the camera other than stopping it down between these 2 shots. So the camera sat on a tripod, same distance to the subject. I had, of course, to give a little bit more light to the right-hand side here because it's stopped down, but otherwise I really didn't touch the camera between these 2. And what you would like to see is, of course, that there is no changes between these 2. And I'm happy to say that if I look at this, I cannot see that focus has shifted from the fully open to the stop down here to the right. And that is good news, because that means that if you're shooting on a DSLR with the focus system they typically have, and you're not shooting in live view, then you will not have a misfocus issue because of this focus shift with this lens. So that is very good news. And I think actually super important. And I think actually super important when you evaluate the practical use of this lens, it doesn't appear to have focus shift. Here you see the bokeh at fully open 1.8, and as you can see, the outer focus elements here, they're a bit oval when you move away from the center, but in the center they're very beautiful, if you ask me. If you stop down to 2.5, you start to see the blades, and at 4.0 you can actually almost see the corners made up by the blades here, right? You can really tell what the blades look like in the lens. But I think, to me, this is fine. 1.8, 2.5, 4.0, I have no complaints. Other reviewers talk about onion rings and bullseyes and whatnot. I have no idea what they're talking about. I just like these outer focus elements, I must say, just speaking as a layman in terms of bokeh at least. I like this example here because this is shot fully open to the right and 6.3 to the left. And this illustrates both how the outer focus elements fully open, they really get blurred and creamy, I would say, here in the background. Also notice here in the foreground how different they are between the 2 examples here. And if we zoom in here a little bit, a little illustration of how thin the depth of field is. You can see the right hand side here of the spider web, which is angled just a little bit towards me. And you can see that in the fully open here to the right, the spider web quickly gets out of focus, right? Whereas at 6.3, it stays sharp. So really careful with that depth of field. But as you can see here, I think the out of focus elements are beautiful. I do notice though, as with the other shots, it gets a little bit oval when you get away from the center, but I don't think anyone but a photographer would notice. I think this really works, and it makes the subject stand out in a great way, much better than here at 6.3. So in total, no complaints when it comes to bokeh. As you can see here, this lens does suffer from focus breathing, and it doesn't really matter which aperture you're at, it has lots of it. So if you're a videographer, you probably want to stay clear of this lens, and if you want to do focus stacking as a macro photographer, I strongly doubt that you would choose this lens. So for videographers, this is an issue. For the rest of us, I think it is less of an issue. Fully open, the lens produces some okay sun stars with 14 peaks due to the 7 rounded blades. But if you are not fully stopped down, the sun stars is not really to my liking. You can see here I'm at 7.1 in this example here, and this looks like a mess to me. I really like sun stars from straight blades, but of course straight blades has the downside that it influences your bokeh, so I guess there really is no free lunch in photography. You can see the little green dot jumping around in front of the loudspeaker. That's the flare from the iPhone, and I think it's pretty well controlled. I have no complaints here. Maybe you are more demanding than me, but for my use, this is fine. So finally here at the conclusion, what to make of this little lens here, 139 euros with autofocus capabilities on really many cameras. And I think actually that's one of the first things I would bring up as a really big benefit with this lens, is that it will focus on your entry-level Nikon DSLRs. It will focus on your mirrorless if you have an FTZ or FTC adapter. And of course it will focus on, many other cameras, but these are traditionally those two groups where not all lenses will focus. If you buy a traditional AF lens, you need to make sure that your camera has a built-in autofocus motor. No need to do that with this one. Also, it's very silent and it's fast. It works really well. If you want to see more about the autofocus on this lens, head over to Omar Gonzalez channel. He has a test where he tests the autofocus intensively on the FTZ adapter. And that appears to work really well. So I would say, even though you may get the impression when you see this review that this lens has many things where it's not a top performer, you have to factor in two things. I think one is the price, and the other thing is what are you going to use it for? Because many of the things I've shown you where you can find errors and faults and things that don't work with this lens, that's if you zoomed in like 300% and really pixel peep. I don't think your clients will look at you and say, hey, there's some purple fringing up in that corner, or it isn't as sharp here in the center as I've seen other images. I really doubt that will happen. It will only be you as a photographer who sort of wants to have the best lens, of course, in front of you. And you will notice these things when you work in Lightroom. In terms of color rendition, I haven't said anything about that in the review. It was long enough as it was, so I try to keep things out of the review. But color rendition is one thing, and that's because I find color rendition to be super subjective. So I don't normally comment on that, but I will say if you like the way Nikon in general renders colors, this lens won't disappoint you. Also, I don't say so much about barrel distortion or distortion in general, or vignetting, because I think you can fix that in post. So I don't really understand why we spend so much time on these things. You can just remove that very easily, just pushing a button in Lightroom. The other things I've talked about, the aberrations, that's more difficult sometimes, and that's why I think in terms of saving time, it's better that the lens has aberrations well under control, rather than that it generates a bit distortion that you can just remove by clicking a button. What's the obvious alternatives to this one? Well, there are several in Nikon's lineup, and maybe I should do a separate video about that because it's a big subject and this video is long enough as it is. I will say though that you can get a 1.4 version of this, which is obviously faster and also much more expensive. And I think the jury is a little bit out on whether the 1.4, the 1.8 is the sharpest. I think they are very close, subject to which reviewer you study. But of course, if you need the extra speed, the extra light that the 1.4 gives you, then that is the one to go for. You can also go for the 1.2. Then you will get manual focus. That's a fantastic lens with, super sharp. And that's also why when I said this one wasn't the sharpest I had tested, that's because the sharpest I have tested is the 1.2 50mm. And you can see my review. I'll post a link to that. That is an amazing lens. And of course, this little thing here can't compete with that. But we're also talking a very different price range there. So in all, I would say if you are after a 50mm lens, a prime, and you don't want to break the bank, you want to make sure that you have silent and efficient autofocus and, not stellar, but really good image quality, I think this little lens here should be on your shortlist. Yep, that's it from me. As always, happy shooting. Take care. Bye-bye.